Good evening, folks. Welcome to the Joko. Welcome to the Joko Collective tonight. Where are we? We are now in April, right? This April 3rd, first Thursday of the month. Welcome as always. I'm Brother Youssef, member of the Joko Collective, a poet, a professor, and happy to be one of your interlocutors tonight. And with me is my partner and comrade, Tasha. Hi, Tasha.
Hi, Yusuf. Good to see you. Had a good day?
It's been an interesting, good day. Yeah, it's been a good day. It didn't go according to my idealized plans, but everything else is getting accomplished as it needs to be one way or another. So,
Oh,
which
oh,
really just means I didn't have time to go to the tax man today. So
oh man. Okay.
I try to hold off for next week.
It's April. More
I
April
know.
stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. Because it's
Greetings,
a
greetings, everyone. And yes, I'm Tasha, member of the Joko Collective, concerned sister in the community. Um, I think I wrote in a some kind of little bio blurb I did for myself, a person who works, mothers and resists in Los Angeles County, um, the unceded lands of Tongva people, which is where we always start, um, acknowledging our lineage, our personal lineage, our family lineages through which we get all our um, uncountable idiosyncratic
mhm.
mannerisms and personality persuasions and all of these different things that have us express as individuals in the world. And those folk who by their by their being in their ways helped us to become people who are concerned about the world and concerned about um, creating a just world and
Yes.
food at the center of our life. I mean, what else? There's choices in this? No, I can't see them. Um, so yeah, always grateful for that those wonderful lineages that we come through on. Um, the lineages of greater lineage of African peoples and
Mhm.
the resistors and victors and creators and innovators and uh, generals and maneuverers and all
Mhm.
people who have resisted, and we know resisted, except that the hunter is currently telling the story, um, or had the let's say the hunter is currently telling the story, or at least the hunter's story is still a bit more popular than the lion
Mhm.
story.
Mhm.
Right?
And doing everything possible to keep the lion story suppressed, right? And
Yes, trying to
yeah,
put the cat back in the bag, but you can't put the lion back in the bag. The lion's out
yeah.
of the bag. And yeah, and so we have the privilege of being familiar with some of the heroes of our collective African heritage in resistance to this scourge of capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of these cultural and social scourges um, that leave the vast majority of the peoples of the planet in misery.
Yeah.
Yep. And
I
we,
was thinking about that, right? The this, as folks are commenting on and offering an analysis and forecast of, what do these tariffs mean? What
mm,
are the likely effects to be? The expectations of a recession, a
right.
depression, And again, I hear people,
Mm,
economists, right, talk about the the
mhm,
cyclical character of these crises in capitalism, right?
mhm,
What did Richard Wolff say? The average is between what 4 to 7 years, and there's a. But I was
mhm,
thinking, yeah, that's right. And how many of those have I lived through, right, already? And it never seems to get better when the crisis is supposed to be over. But
mm,
I was thinking, isn't capitalism the damn crisis? I mean,
mhm.
capitalism is the crisis.
Is the crisis.
Keeps
Mm,
most people living constantly in a crisis state.
mhm, mm,
So anyway, yeah,
mhm.
the
Absolutely.
human crisis of capitalism.
Yeah.
Um,
There
yeah,
there's a better theory to follow, generated out of the substance of the same cultural continuum.
hmm
There is a better theory, there is a better answer, there is a better plan
something
available.
more rational
Rational, livable, humane,
and
all of these things.
all able to adapt also. Um,
And adaptable.
yeah,
There is absolute right, there's a better suggestion. There's
yeah,
something that will very likely work better and proves itself to work better in the spaces where um, it's been applied, to whatever
hmm
extent it's been applied. So
hmm
absolutely, and that is, I think that is very important to say actually, you know, because part of the glamour of the thing is the notion that it's inevitable, you know,
right,
that it's inevitable and uh like one cannot be without it, cannot recover from it. It has to be, has to be all these things. But I understand Brick's been working on currency solutions that don't depend on
hmm
the US dollar. So, you know, there's all kinds of things that are amiss. And so, in this extended little uh, little invocation that we're doing here, we also always recognize that we, as African descended people on Turtle Island, are doing this work, this liberation work, at the hospitality of the ancestors of the First Nations people, um, in the land that we are, in the lands that our families come from, uh, the states, I should say,
hmm hmm
multi-generational African immigrants to
hmm
base, right? Louisiana, Texas,
the traditional Confederacy.
the traditional Confederacy, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and I guess the untraditional or non-traditional Confederacy too, whatever that is. I guess that's everything south of Canadian border.
Everything south of the Canadian border. No,
It's
it's
an interesting time. I keep interrupting you. Let you
that's
finish
all
when
right.
you
No,
communication.
that's all right. No, that's all right. Because really, who says an invocation has to be some kind of separate
Right.
script of a, you know, we're
Yeah.
just segueing into the vibe of what we're talking about and getting ourselves grounded in, our
Yeah.
reality, calling it forth. So it ain't got to sound no particular way.
Yeah.
Mm. So yes, we give that thanks to and acknowledge the First Nations ancestors and people at whose hospitality we do this work, and
Mhm.
look forward um, to translating that uh, appreciation into deeper constructive relationships and alliances, even
Yes.
within our, in our small space that we always hope to make as potent as possible.
That's right.
Right. And so there is our invocation. We have
Yeah.
said it. We have done it. Right. And so here we are tonight,
Yes. Here we
continuing with
are tonight.
tonight's for on progress. And Brother Yusuf, please
Well,
introduce.
I was going to say, right, thinking about the Confederacy and everything south of the Canadian border, being the Confederacy, at least culturally, right? The I was reminded suddenly of this, one of those a film from the early 2000s, I believe, right? One of these mockumentaries
Mhm.
called CSA, Confederate States of America.
Oh, I didn't see it.
It's interesting, and the conceit of the film is that the South won the Civil War.
Mm,
And so the entire United States became the Confederate States of America instead of the United States.
mhm,
And so slavery continued. All so it imagines, right, the culture, the social relations of the South coming well into the 20th century.
mhm,
People being having their careers ruined with the notion of the one drop. You lose your career, and
mhm,
got folks like um, what's his name, Mark Twain, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and you sort of pick your highlights of American of U.S. Culture, literature, who are
mhm.
all in exile in Canada, right? And it's sort of thing, like it's really interesting. It's a good, and I mean, it's like we're living in that movie, suddenly, right? And this as this regime has come to power. So like, oh, it's time to look at that movie again, right? It's time to watch CSA, Confederate States of America again.
Gotta
Uh,
drop that in the box. Gotta
yeah,
find it. Go
yeah.
ahead. Mhm,
CSA, Confederate States of America,
mhm.
mockumentary, right? And it is funny, right? It's got its little, it's a mockumentary. It's got its humor in it, but of course, it's a very serious topic. And
Mhm,
and again, what it speculates it is also a commentary not on what might have been, but also on what is, right? Even if not under the guise of Confederate States of America, um,
mhm.
terms of the social relations that we've inherited and indeed that have been, harbored and, um, continue to be cultivated and kept alive, right?
Right.
Which is part of what we're talking about tonight, right? Even though the specific topic is religion's role, right,
Mm,
in this resistance to progress and scientific knowing, and all the things we've been talking about.
mhm,
The, and but also I am in my office, and because it's movie night for the TBD Club, and they just screened a showing of Jojo Rabbit to talk about encroaching fascism, and at any rate, I have to step away for a moment because they're waiting for me to open the door so they can bring stuff to the office. So I will
okay,
be right back. You can
okay.
regale them with.
I will regale. I will
Yes, and I
regale.
will return momentarily.
Okay, great. So, yes, our dear Professor Doucet will return momentarily and get us righteously, historically oriented as we kind of look at the career of, kind of the career of the conservative Christian movement in America, and looking at it in a space that kind of everybody talks about it from, during the Reagan years and a little bit pre-Reagan years, kind of in that transition era, um, into that neoconservatism and the, um, what it meant to be uh, associated with the quote unquote moral majority, these notions and the kinds of issues and politics and priorities that those groups raised, from school prayer to um, evolutionism
Thank
to
you for covering. But
oh,
yeah,
okay, that was quick.
we could hear you, so you can
Oh, okay, that was
go
quick.
with the flow.
Okay,
You can drop the stuff off. They know I'm online and kind
okay.
of live
So
stream.
basically, well, then you heard what I said. So yeah, evolutionism, the discourse of dinosaurs being coterminous with human beings, with this reaching toward a bibl a timeline of what, planetary history. Kind of, yeah, timeline of planetary history and
Geological
human
history
history,
and sort of stellar time, even, right?
even.
Geological time, which
Yes,
again, geological time is nothing compared to stellar time. And
the
the
attempt,
notion
yeah,
that our sun, right, the Earth's sun, Sol, right, is a third generation star, right? Our sun has a grandparent. That's
right.
stellar
Mhm,
time. The
mhm. Just profound, just
So I want
profound.
to make I know, right? Just to contemplate that, right?
And so just to
It's
finish
awe
that
inspiring.
stream, just to
Right?
finish that stream.
Yeah, yeah.
So then the politics of anti-choice, pro-life, the um, concomitant terrorism, abortion clinic terrorism, and all of the things that the social um, uh, what is the word I'm trying to, imperatives, kind of like the mores, right,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
came with this assertion of being the representative of Christian values, right? Which is something that we look forward to taking issue with and really scrutinizing as a construct, a peculiarly American construct, perhaps, or at least a very specifically American construct, that is, of like so many of these, not factual, not actual, um, and damaging in damaging in the all of the space that it takes up, all of the space that it inhabits in the American imagination. You know, the
Hmm.
the of the Christian
Hmm.
as conservative and representing a certain slew of politics, a certain company of political positions.
And there's certainly analogs around the world in other places, right? A lot of these, particularly right-wing authoritarian
Hmm.
movements, governments, have proclaimed themselves the protectors of some, traditional form of Christianity, whether Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, at various points, right? That's not unusual.
Hmm.
And again, with the same, sort of that same kind of rhetoric, though, of protecting traditional values, the defenders of Western civilization, as the case might be, etc. Right? So there's certainly analogs, um,
Hmm.
or those sectors of the religions in those countries, right? Like what's his name, um,
Victor.
Franco Spain, right?
Okay. Mhm.
At least the hierarchy or the official church, right? In fascist Spain, right? And This is, I believe Spain is the home of Opus Dei, right? During this,
Okay. Mhm,
I believe it was a Spanish priest,
mhm,
early 20th century, founded before the Spanish Civil War, but nonetheless, in response, or reaction to, some of the, the revolutionary fervor, uh, the democratization and secularization, right, that modernity, often generates or has generated. So yeah, it's so the United States fits right into the model,
m'kay.
and it has been such a feature though of the United States, which has always been a relatively conservative
Mhm.
society, right? It's one of the reasons what Dr. Gerald Horne, right? It calls it the counter revolution of 1776 because in many ways it was backward looking, right? Right, wanting to maintain the period or the slave economy and hold on to their property, whatever the crown was deciding. So and the so I was going to make a reference, right? As I often do, a movie reference that I'm reminded of. Um, I think that captures the obstacle that religion in the West, as particularly as it as Christ,
Mhm.
as Christianity developed, um, was practiced, whatever, right? In the West, this film from the 1990s, Restoration, with what's his name, Downey Jr., Robert Downey Jr.
Mhm,
Um, in which he plays a doctor, right? But
mhm,
there's this one particular scene where doctors, I think it's like the 1600s,
mhm,
and the doctors, and so I think it's under Charles II, right, of England, during the Restoration, right, period, right, capital R. The So there's a scene where these various doctors have gathered, and it's all surreptitious and underground because the church would be opposed to what they were doing, right?
mhm,
And in this case, the church is not the Roman Catholic Church, but
mhm,
the Anglican Church, right? Because this is after the Church of England has split from Rome. Um, and there, in the scene, there is a man there who, through whatever accident or whatever, has an exposed heart. He wears like a flap over it. They put something over it, but you
mhm,
know, so they can actually take a look at his heart, right? See a human heart as it beats, and
mhm,
um, but to do so is contraband for them to do this, right? Sometime in the 1600s, because of the restrictions that the church puts on it and how medicine is to be practiced.
mhm,
Um, the character that Robert Downey Jr. plays, and this is based on an actual historical figure. Um, he distinguishes himself by being willing to touch the heart, right, of the beating heart. Um, so quite interesting, right? But it reminds me for how long uh,
mhm,
uh, the religionist in Europe and Europe's satellites around the
mhm,
world, particularly North America, uh,
mhm,
have had this paradoxical relationship with like science and scientific inquiry. Where on the one hand, right, it's it was the within the church that you could find the scientists, right? You know the
mhm,
the academic learning, the research, etc.
mhm,
Again,
mhm,
both Copernicus and Kepler were both priests, right? They were both priests of the Catholic Church. And indeed, the Catholic Church, has had a Vatican astronomer for I don't know how long, right? And has always, what's the word I want to say, patronized the sciences, right? Patronized the arts and the sciences. And so there's always been this kind of ambivalence, I guess, right? And even what we popularly think about, like the trial of Galileo, isn't everything we think about it, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
even, you know, it's not even that they denied his findings just out of hand, right? But there's something more complicated going on there, right? Than just and Galileo himself, right, remains a devout Catholic and never, thought about leaving the church. Didn't see any kind of contradiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have mentioned it before. Again, I can't cite, chapter and verse, but Augustine of Hippo, right? Saint Augustine of Hippo, and I believe one of the Anselms of England during the Middle Ages, both make the point that when natural philosophy, by which they mean what we think of as basically the physical sciences, right, and life science in particular, but the physical sciences,
Mm-hmm.
when science demonstrates a truth about the world,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that might contradict scripture.
Mm-hmm.
It is not the correct choice to deny the science, but to think about how we must interpret scripture, right? To revisit the scripture to find
Mm-hmm.
the higher truth. And
Mm-hmm.
simply put, but that is like suppressed knowledge, or just allowed to to be disappeared. So from the very beginning of the I, I guess, well, I'm trying not to use the word progress, right? But these the development of science in the modern era, right? In modernity, the various things we think about in terms of the increased knowledge of astronomy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Folks have learned more about physics, um, geology, all the various sciences that the hard sciences. What we mean by that, right? Physical sciences, life sciences, as they have emerged,
Mm-hmm.
has found, it's run up against some resistance from the church. So what we're experiencing now with this like super invigorated religious um, denial, or religiously based denial of science, right? Scientific understanding, um, what we know through science, has a prehistory,
Par for the course. Mm-hmm.
right? That has informed it, but that also with each new generation of believers, right? As those scientific discoveries have become part of regular life, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it finds a way to accept it, live with it, and
Mm-hmm.
including the theologians, right, and the preachers
Mm-hmm.
who have also made the adjustment. But there's the hardcore that continues, right, to push back and against all the various things like you were mentioning, um, creating
Mm-hmm.
these narratives where humans and dinosaurs coexist, right,
Mm-hmm.
that the Earth is only 7,000 years old, maybe 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
All these sorts of things, and even that there's biblical justification for uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know uh, separation of the so-called races, or all of
Absolutely.
these various things, right?
Mhm.
Um, that are challenged by the Big Bang um, theory, right? Uh,
Mhm.
the understanding of the
Hmm.
origins of what we call the universe, and uh,
Mhm.
time and energy and all
Mhm.
mass, right?
Mhm.
And the theory of evolution, and
Mhm.
and that, right, all of that, and that we might, and our relationship to other
Beings, right?
planet, right, exactly, and that what's translated as dominion over can be translated other ways too,
Mhm.
or it's
Mhm.
translated as custodian and or caretaker, right? And
Mhm.
um,
So it's part of what I'm hearing, that kept jumping out at me as you were talking about is the characteristic of, I don't really want to use the term diversity. It's coming up in my head
mm,
because, you know, but of um diversity in thought, of
mhm,
complication, of, you know what I'm saying,
mhm,
of um this kind of, and I always like to mention Halisi when I use this word because I heard it from him, it was so characteristic. This grappling character,
mhm,
the process of a kind of a collective settling into an idea of a kind of a general cultural consensus, not
mhm,
of one community or another, but something that becomes generalized. And largely, I was hunting some articles earlier today, and I found some really nice work behind a paywall in Nature
mhm,
magazine. Really promising titles like, science can solve most of the world's problems. Why aren't governments, really engaging science, the scientific community, and tapping it, right? And so this was the subject, of the article. It gave a lot of really interesting um uh points of departure and explanations for
mhm,
why this wasn't happening, in the way that perhaps people would presume that it is, or, you know, in the way that folks maybe even would presume that it should be,
mhm,
but that kind of disconnect that we always talk about also is representative of the failure of scientific ideas and understandings to gain this kind of collective consensus, and so ideas can be turned around, ideas can be reshaped, can be reformed, folks can be redirected. Nothing, as it is written in stone, kind of until it is, you know.
mhm,
Um, and but this thing is so much a um, it's a uh, I'm hesitating because there's another word I don't want to use, but it's the only phrase that will come to mind. This war of ideas,
mhm,
and which idea, but it's not a set of ideas and ideology that through the vehicle of a state apparatus will, oppress, repress,
mhm,
exile, and exact violence on all, other carriers of an ideology, but the potency of an idea to, neutralize a poor idea. You know, how does that? I wonder. You know how that translates. I wonder how that translates, and we see so much of that since we are kind of segueing into this
well, I
question.
don't, since the science communicators
Hmm.
don't communicate as effectively,
Hmm.
or and it maybe is the character of what's being communicated. Um, I mean, just in it would seem that in the mid 20th century, and I want to say the mid 20th century because what we've got the 1920s, and there's the Scopes trial, right, in Tennessee, challenging the teaching of evolution.
Mhm.
And Scopes losing that trial, as I recall, right? But then,
Mhm.
evolution eventually becomes,
Yeah.
just part of curriculum. And
Mhm.
then that period post, certainly going into World War II and post World War II, where science is embraced, right? And part of that is the space race and the need to outdo the Soviet Union, etc.
Mhm.
Popular culture is, rife with both kind of mad scientist characters in B movies, but also scientific heroes, right? In various movies and
Mhm.
television. Um,
Mhm.
well into into the 70s, into the 80s, into the 90s, even, right? But at the same time, are very got more or less contemporary with as um, theories, the theory of evolution, the Big Bang theory, the nuclear um, science, astrophysics, etc. Space travel um, have a certain kind of popularity and cachet, and then certainly the various advances in medical science for sure, right? That
Yeah.
people want to hold on to and embrace. But this is the exact period also of the rise of the religious right. Particularly beginning in the 1950s, um,
Mhm.
the emergence of the televangelist,
Mhm. Mhm.
the radio
Mhm.
evangelist, the
Mhm.
travel, the celebrity evangelist, right? Somebody like Billy Graham, selling
Mhm.
out stadiums,
Mhm.
um,
Which as
challenging challenging the scientific narrative, and
Mhm.
doing so in a way um, that moves people, right? Because it is an emotive presentation.
Mhm. Mhm.
People, we are moved. Right? We are emotional beings, right? And
Yes.
people respond to that, and sometimes that's what these science communicators are up against, right? How do you move people
Mhm.
with your science?
Right, which I think is one of the things that makes Neil deGrasse Tyson such a popular scientist and science communicator,
Hmm.
because he has that capacity,
You
to
need it. Hmm.
and, characters like I can't call a lot of them, but, characters like who was the dude in the 2000s, 90s, 2000s, did kids shows, and it's
Bill
a
Nye, the science
thank
guy.
you. It's a
Yeah,
shame I couldn't call his
yeah.
name. But yes,
They're
Bill Nye.
particularly, trying to fire the imagination of children around science.
Yes, and the fun of it, and the wonder of it, and the
Hmm.
yeah, and the joy of discovery, you know? Um, and the
But
fun
here's a difference, though, right?
Mhm,
Um, Billy Graham,
mhm,
Oral Roberts, what's his name, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and all the other names I can't recall.
mhm.
Who was the guy? Creflo Dollar,
Creflo, mhm,
and who was the original Reverend Ike
mhm,
back in the day.
yeah,
These folks had, besides radio shows and television shows, right? Radio shows and television shows that were, and on just regular broadcast television. Um, Neil deGrasse Tyson, before him, Carl Sagan,
right,
the great days of Cosmos.
right,
The Cosmos was on PBS, which
right,
doesn't reach as many. Bill Nye the Science Guy, right?
yeah,
PBS.
mhm,
And does it doesn't reach as many people, right? So it's already, and then the people who do go there self-select in a kind of particular way, right? The PBS, the typical PBS audience, even for the children's programming, when Bill Nye, even after school programming, not every parent, so, um, those very effective science communicators,
Hmm.
still operating, at a disadvantage, a media disadvantage. Right?
Yeah, but also just yes, very importantly, um, but also just pointing out that that is the effectiveness of communication, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to inspire, the ability to move, the ability to invoke an emotion and or evoke an emotion. And you also, which you have referred to before, and that's part and parcel even of this, part and parcel and uh, ancestral to this new evangelical piece happening in the 50s, is that Great Awakening history in the United
Mm-hmm. The
States.
multiple great awakenings in the United States.
Multiple Great Awakenings history in the
Mm-hmm.
United States.
And
So it's
particularly in the U.S. is, I guess, what could be called its formative decades.
mhm, mhm,
Colonial, that is pre-United States, and then early
mhm,
United States, and
mhm, mhm.
and that seemed to be, it's like the Great Awakenings never stop in in the United States. It
Hey,
feels like, right?
yeah, yeah, and this energy of revival of, and this energy
This,
of
yes.
mass, attendance to,
Mhm. The,
organized
the
around a
itinerant minister,
yes,
right? The
itinerant,
itinerant
that's the word,
preacher.
the itinerant single, personality,
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
charismatic, if you will,
Charismatic, absolutely.
charismatic, person, right?
Hmm.
And I guess
Hmm.
later on, and I'm thinking of, this is a shame, Tammy and, who the
Tammy Faye,
Tammy Faye and
her husband.
her
Uh,
husband.
I can't.
I can see them.
I've gone blank on. I can see his face, but I'm
Jim,
blanking on his name. Yeah,
Jim.
Jim Baker.
Thank
Jim
you.
Baker.
And
Jim
Tammy
and Tammy Faye Baker. Yeah,
Baker.
yeah,
Yes.
with two K's.
Kind of create, yes, I don't know if they so much created it, but they certainly were idealized and memorialized as a couple,
Mm-hmm.
season to, kind of moving away from
Mm-hmm.
single male
Mm-hmm.
charismatic figure.
Mm-hmm.
uh, But that, just as a kind of an interesting, just kind of as an interesting piece in looking at the depth of um the depth of the cultural entrenchment of that kind of evangelical
Mm-hmm.
presentation, that kind of evangelical, performance, and just
And of course,
it's a
you know,
cultural presentation.
we're here in Los Angeles, right? The
Mhm,
self-described entertainment capital of the world. And of
mhm,
course, this is the home of the radio, the mass media evangelist, Amy Semple McPherson, right? I think, well, certainly the 30s. Maybe she started in the 20s.
okay.
That the building should still be there. The domed building, the domed church, right there, next to Echo Park.
Mm,
I think that's Glendale Boulevard, or
mm,
but yeah, right. That domed building was the Amy Semple McPherson, whatever temple. But yeah, absolutely. So the pioneer really of the mass media evangelical evangelist, and again, her politics also were quite conservative. Um,
mm,
maybe maybe to some degree anti-establishment, but conservative. And of course, when she is operating in the 30s, the establishment is the New Deal, right? So if you're anti-establishment, um,
mhm,
the But
Mhm.
there's another aspect I don't want us to overlook.
Mhm.
Really, there are a couple of things, right? Because we've been talking primarily, sort of the tradition of the itinerant, preacher in the United States, the traditions of the various great awakenings, and the generally deep religiosity of the United States historically, various to various levels, and
Mhm.
those were primarily, Protestant
Mhm.
movements, formations, the sort of the kind of U.S. born and generated religions, like what becomes Mormonism, and the other branches that branch off from Mormonism, Community of Christ and others. Um, Again, really coming out of the Protestant tradition, although at the same time the Protestant tradition, um, reformist, right? It's there in the name, Protestant Reformation, but also suspicious, right, of the various scientific, right, discovery and explanation of the world.
Mhm.
But I think we live in the United States now, where I believe the primary denomination is now Catholic, right, Roman Catholic, uh,
Mm.
from being, a minority Christian denomination, certainly through the 19th century and maybe even the early 20th century, to now,
Mm.
I think the most numerous,
Okay.
numerically,
Okay.
um, and
Mm.
a lot of that has to do with immigration, right? The early, late 19th century, early 20th century resistance to immigration was part of that was anti-Catholicism, right? Because folks are coming from Italy
Yes.
and Ireland and
Yes.
you know, Croatia, the other countries that would be Catholic, or they're
Yeah.
coming from places like Greece or Armenia that have their own Catholic tradition, right, or Orthodox tradition, but the same kind of church, not Protestant.
Hmm.
But really, just and the Catholic prohibition against birth control
Mhm.
been in place. So typically larger Catholic families through the 20th century, typically, right? Doesn't
Mhm.
remain that way, but typically. And then again, the number, the immigration from Latin America.
Mhm.
And even though the evangelical movement has been growing among, Latin descent communities, at least since the 90s, it's still not the largest group, right? Um, Pretty much every Latin American country or every country that has a French background, right? Uh,
Uh-huh.
and then, and then all of the Protestant countries of Europe, there were Catholic minorities, right? England, Germany. I don't even
Mm.
know if they're a minority in Germany. I mean, some some principalities Catholic, some etc. Though,
Mhm.
so that over time and and I bring that up uh, to say there's been a merging, right? Conservative Catholicism, making common cause with some of the evangelical Protestants,
Mhm.
um, able to coalesce around particular issues, primarily abortion,
Mhm.
and in some cases, um, the role of women. In
Mhm.
some cases, though, right, depends on how conservative Catholics are, how
Mhm.
conservative the Protestants are, because
Mhm.
Protestantism, for a very long time,
Mhm.
had no prohibition against birth control, for example. And
Mhm.
only recently, meaning like in the last 40 years or so, began to push back on abortion, right? As it became an issue to get voters out. So
Mhm.
this melding
Mhm.
of conservative Catholics for whom abortion had always been an issue,
Mhm.
but per church ruling, typically are opposed to the death penalty. The some of these traditional Protestants and then evangelical Protestants, um, typically okay with birth control, had a place, a space for abortion, but pro death penalty, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then these right wing politicians, right? The political right, the right wing of the Republican Party,
Mhm.
who see these groups as votes and a way
Seats.
to split votes,
Mhm.
right? Split
Mhm.
off these Catholics who primarily voted Democratic for a long time, can be
Mhm.
split off, right? At least a certain
Mhm.
percentage around this one issue. Um,
Mhm.
and then if the evangelicals and other Protestants can be brought on board as anti-abortion.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and just like this last election, you
Mhm.
don't need major swings. You just need to
Mhm.
be able to pull off small percentages, and over time, right, pull
Mhm.
off, those small percentages, and that's still all they ever need because the Republican Party is still a minority party in this country.
Right. Right.
That's all
As
they
are
need are
these
slivers.
views,
Yeah, as
apparently,
are these views exactly.
by all measures, by all broader measures,
Yes.
statistical measures, a small portion of the polity that gets all this amplification, gets all of this
Yep.
attention, and it's very, very interesting how well money is involved,
Well, that's it. That's the other thing. Money is involved.
resourcing of it and the underwriting of,
Heavily
the
resourced.
yeah, by one or another of these elements,
Exactly.
of this
And many of these,
of
I mean,
this
I, the finances of the Catholic Church are a little more complicated, right? Because not every, each parish is in a way on its own.
Mhm,
And so you have rich parishes, or maybe super rich, and
mhm,
little poor parishes.
mhm,
Whatever, the church as a
mhm,
worldwide body has, whatever the Vatican controls or whatever, but,
mhm,
these local churches.
mhm,
Um, by contrast, though, many of these mega churches
mhm,
that now dot the country, or these televangelists, um, they're bringing in like millions a week.
right, right, right,
So, and are able, and thereby, and millions a week untaxed because they're churches,
yeah,
and their properties are untaxed because they're churches often, although that's not always so clear. So I know, for example, Catholic Charities has to pay some kind of tax, right? um, Even though they're religiously affiliated, they're
okay,
not the church itself,
mhm,
something like that. But
mhm,
anyway, but also these other funders, right? And
mhm,
the same kinds of billionaire and super multimillionaire interest that
mhm,
also fund these right wing think tanks
absolutely,
and
mhm,
policy, councils.
right,
So they're receiving the same kind of funding, right? So they're funding those aspects of well, they're funding right wing religion also, right?
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
as folks are finding ways to make common cause,
mhm,
um, to promote the agenda that we end up with now. Because
mhm,
what we know is many of these billionaires, and there are some who are believers, but many of them aren't, but they're strategic, right? In who and what they deploy,
mhm,
um, to create in their efforts to create the world that we are now confronting,
mhm,
as the right wing we know is fully empowered in this
mhm,
country, and the Christian right,
yes,
along with some members of the Jewish right,
mhm,
other religionists who
mhm,
share similar notions or similar anxieties about a purely scientific explanation of the world, or what generally think of, and
Mhm.
secularism. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
And and
mhm,
interestingly, um, or I should say, I would like to look also, yes, there's this problem of uh, resisting secularism, right? And all
mhm,
that that implies, and all the kinds of rhetorics that emerge that kind of fall back on that. I mean, relate back to that, even
mhm,
newer, what to my ears, and I might be wrong, but is a newer discourse about the you know intellectual elites, the elites, and referring
mhm.
the you know to folks with degrees of one
Right.
kind or another,
That's
more or
right.
less, never
That's
mind
exactly right.
the academics and the folks who are in that area, and in that work. But there's also this, while that's being amplified, as just said, the promoting of this particular brand of rightist Christianity happens also as the progressive brands of these religious orders are muted, right?
Right.
And so we come away,
And
um,
demonized even now, right?
yes, and I'm gonna want to play a clip at a certain point in terms of the demonization, but I'm going to ask you what you mean by that in a second. I'm going to ask you what you mean by that. But muted, invisibilized. Um, who's asking about, well, what happened with the religious folk who were linking up with the civil rights workers and
Mhm.
the radicals of the time. You know, what's happened with, what about the all of the ecumenical voices that are in our current politic,
Mhm.
that have been so outspoken and so clear about the Palestine genocide, colonization, all of these things, all of these politics. But um, it develops into some, how these things combine into this particular brand of American fascism. And as you course corrected earlier and said, well, all of this is part and parcel of an ongoing Western conservatism, whether it's in Europe or in Europe's colonial
South
world,
America, yeah, in many ways.
right, any of these places, how that emerges, has emerged specifically with in these last few decades. I was um, looking at Chris Hedges earlier, who we will cite as we're talking about these things going forward in this little series, who has spent a lot of time thinking about the Christian right and Christian nationalism, and you know, and the has long been, like, for 10 years, talking about these people are about to, these folk here, they're about to, they're about to trip, And one of the things, he was in a conversation with someone else who was a historian of the same, and a researcher of the same phenomenon. And the historian talked about the specifically looking at Trump, right? Talked about the wedding of the prosperity gospel performance and presentation and monologue style, if you will, at these rallies, and in terms of the messaging, you know, and in conversation with the people who are, who are attending, who are, what their understandings and expectations are, you know, um, morphing into something else that he describes to, that I can leave, but essentially where he has become for some sectors of his base, of Trump's base, uh, more and more of this Christ-like figure.
Well, he's become an object of worship,
He's
right?
become an object of
And
worship.
there are even folks writing new theologies or whatever, um,
Hmm.
about it. For whatever. Yes, but again, and a lot of that is based in what, fear, and fear and fear, right? And whatever he promises about
Mhm.
restoring them, right? And
Right.
um,
Mhm.
a bulwark against the great replacement, or even the notions of an imperfect vessel. Um, the so anyway,
Mhm.
that the progressive religionists are still there. They didn't go anywhere, right?
Mhm.
They have been part of the target of the preaching, right, of the
Mhm.
right, right, and been accused of all sorts of things, like falling into pantheism and polytheism, if they're talking about respecting the earth. And I mean, all so they've been there, but they too don't have a television network like the 700 Club, or whatever the what was it, the T, not, see, there's TBS and TNT, but there was some other T something, but
Mhm.
TBN,
Mhm.
Trinity Broadcasting Network, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
and they're not showing up, and they're not invited into those spaces to preach. And if they aren't being covered in the news, it's so maybe they're known more locally, right? And without a or and I was going to say without some sort of national movement, but the national movements have continued. It really is, how has coverage of movements and coverage of those folks, how's that changed, right? There was a sanctuary movement in the 1980s for folks fleeing Central America, and that was also during the Reagan period, right? And if that got covered, it was covered, often in terms of why are these people breaking the law, or harboring,
Mhm.
and that and
Mhm.
those tendencies still.
Mhm.
And that's part of the demonization I was talking about, and I mean that literally, or at least, yeah, literally. Many of these, right wing churches or Christian nationalist churches are specifically saying, the problem with that church over there is that they have been infiltrated by demons, and they
Mhm.
mean that, right?
Okay.
Um, they mean that they must be demonic if they are extending, compassion to, non-gender conforming folks. They must be
Mhm.
demonic. It depends on how conservative or right wing or reactionary the church is, but if they are promoting or accepting, interracial marriage, right? They must be, um,
Mhm.
they're they have fallen into the demonic heresy of Marxism if they're calling for, universal health care, and a peace agenda, and all these. So very recently, um, there's been real talk from ministers that Jesus is too woke, right?
Hmm.
That folks that has come from the mouths of some of these folks, right? As they want a more militant Jesus. Uh,
Mhm.
and very recently, some of the most reactionary of these folks are calling for um, Donald Trump to be a new Constantine, as it were, or maybe Constantine. Maybe it should be Theodosius, who they actually have in mind. But they're saying, right, any church that is flying a rainbow flag should have its property seized by the magistrate, that is, by the state, and then redistributed to the churches with the proper vision. Um,
Mhm.
and Donald Trump is their man, right? He's the one who they think could do that.
Mhm.
These
Mhm.
fine, right? The notion of religious freedom.
Mhm.
No, that indeed the state should serve their churches, and very specifically, seize the property of what they would call apostate churches, whatever the apostasy is, right? Um, women preaching,
Mhm.
pulpit,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
or even, and there's one thing, women preaching in the pulpit,
Mhm.
and another, it's
Mhm.
bad enough, I should say, to allow women to preach in the pulpit or read from scripture, right?
Mhm.
But you also have, female clergy. Are you kidding me? That
Mhm.
would be enough. That's apostasy enough, right? So
Mhm.
that bishop
Mhm.
who, called for Trump and his minions to have mercy,
Mhm.
probably fully aware that it was falling on deaf ears, but it still needed to be said in the moment.
Mhm.
Certainly, that the again the Episcopal Church
Mhm.
would be apostate for even having the notion of a woman who's a
Mhm.
bishop. Are you kidding me?
Mhm.
So that's what they're doing already, right? They're already calling for and that's what I mean by when I say they demonize. I
I
mean
see. Literally.
they
Mhm.
literally accuse
Mhm.
these churches of having demons.
Uh,
We're talking about, and again, talking probably about the various Protestant denominations, because the Catholic Church is kind of a whole other thing because it's just so large, and something that large and institutional has got so much diversity within it, right?
right. Right.
That it's hard to say
Right.
anything,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. Anything
truly
conclusive.
definitive,
Well,
right?
as you're speaking to this, because I do want
One
to.
more thing. I just wanted to, and actually, it's not something I'm going to say, it's something I'm going to share. The journalist, Catherine Stewart,
Mhm.
has been writing about this a lot, and her most recent book, Money, Lies, and God Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. And she's making the rounds right now, being interviewed about this book, but she's written several,
Mhm.
looking specifically at the rise of the religious right and that the wedding of those forces that you were talking about, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and this is an important thing to remember. Um,
Mhm.
Not only has a specific, again, I don't want to overstate it, but at least a significant number of religionists are extremely um,
Hmm.
doubtful
Mhm.
of, if not completely opposed to, forms of democracy, right? And the democratization of decision making,
Mhm.
as a way of, as a form of the state, right? For so yeah, they're opposed to liberal democracy,
Mhm.
and so are actively trying to destroy it for some other hierarchical, more
Mhm.
traditional type
Mhm.
of thing. So,
And yeah, so when we, without the context or a context of some kind, when it is heard or announced in media, oh, JD Vance is a theocrat, or JD Vance is theocracy, or that word is floating around.
mm-hmm.
If it doesn't have something to connect to, if it doesn't have a receptor, it kind of just floats here, there. What does all of this mean? Which is what actually I wanted. Oh, you put the clip. Were you going to show something, or you just wanted?
No, I shared. I just want, if I don't know if you can see it. I just shared
Yeah,
Catherine Stewart and the title, but I know you have a clip you wanted to share.
I do.
Yeah.
Um, and it's and before I do, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the clip I'm going to share, and the need for the context, the need for the background to have any hope for understanding what all of this is really about. What this gets down to, and we say all that, not that there's some kind of linear, inevitable destination, but
Hmm.
certainly a concerted, long-term effort that has relied on certain identifiable tools and is networked in a certain way and is allied in a certain way and is positioning itself in a certain way globally, um, and without kind of having some kind of background, I can see where this could be just like really mystifying, kind of like a how can you think that moment, do you really believe, which is, I'm saying all this because I think you see some of this with the clip I'm going to show. So the journalist, and I'll give a lot of background because I'm not playing the whole thing, um, young woman who's a journalist with MSNBC, um, did did an investigation on the return of young men to this kind of reactionary religious movement, right? And the fundamental notion and the fundamental, presentation is that young men of a certain generation are going into this space and the young women are going out of this space, and the question of what is the appeal, and kind of what are they thinking. And um so that's kind of what the context is. And then the journalist is a young sister. um and I'm going to go ahead and play the clip, and let's see what we see. Oh, do I have it?
It's
Here.
on stage now.
It's on stage? Okay. I'm going to go ahead.
Thing of this world. Are you seeing more young men, Gen Z, come into the church?
Yeah, we are.
For Shane Winnings, who leads the national men's ministry group Promise Keepers,
What kind of man are you?
it's all part of a bigger strategy.
I think it's very intentional. And I think the messaging from the administration was very intentional.
The Trump administration.
Yeah, it was to win those kind of people.
Who?
And the young people, the men who want to be men.
If you fear culture, then you don't fear God.
Men who want to, or can be convinced to, return to what he calls traditional values.
What we're seeing in this erosion where now anyone can be a family. Two men can be a family and they can adopt kids, which I think is problematic. Two women could be a family, they can adopt kids. Marriage doesn't mean anything anymore.
What threat is that to you if those two men love each other?
Because you can point statistically to our society being eroded from within because two men automatically create an unstable household, because that is not God's design for a family.
And you think that hurts America?
Absolutely.
Which extends to policy issues that he believes are fundamentally against God. When we talk about the intertwining of faith and politics, a lot of the messaging here is about eradicating wokeness.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, I think wokeness, is really anything that comes against God's design. It's this progressive mentality. Wokeness is like DEI. Wokeness is...
And you think that's against God?
Yes,
DEI.
100%.
How so?
Well, I mean, it is everything it claims to be against. DEI is discriminatory. It is racist. DEI says, what's your skin color and who do you sleep with? You're getting to the front of the line.
Can I push back on that?
Please.
My interpretation of DEI and affirmative action is essentially saying, not that you must promote me because I'm Black, but you are not allowed to discriminate against me.
But that's already a part of our Constitution and already a part of our laws. DEI has been used to push people to the front of the line who don't belong there.
If someone calls some points and says that's a DEI hire,
I think that's wrong too.
do you think they're pointing at you or do you think they're pointing at me?
I don't know. I'll tell you what, though, I think it's wrong to make a snap judgment. Like, that is not godly.
Because it assumes that the only people who can have good things are straight white men.
Exactly. And that's a problem.
I'm excited. You have your Bible?
So at Promise Keepers, we are pushing biblical truth,
Anybody know who
which
Phyllis
teaches people to look at the character. Listen what people are saying.
Are the young men who support LGBTQ rights or believe in DEI, are they welcome here?
They're welcome. They might not want to come back.
A sentence.
Okay, I'm gonna just cut it there. And I think that the phrasing that captured me, is that all of this progressive, all of this talk of progress, and of course, just that kind of, wokeness is anti-God. It's against the ways of,
Right.
against the ways of God. And kind of very interesting. And
Because nobody can define it, right? Or they have no definition, right? So it's nice and malleable. It means whatever they want it to mean. Has nothing to do with whether one is aware of, dynamics of inequality and
No.
whether or not one should be compassionate or not, and all these other things, right? No, it never even got. There was never even an attempt to understand what was even meant by the term, right? It's
No.
these young people are using it, and these young people picked it up from these Black young people, and we know it is a challenge to the status quo ideology. Therefore, it must be opposed and crushed.
It's supposed to, yeah, right. Eventually, so the other part, how long will they be welcome at the table? Though they won't change the menu, how long will they be welcome at the table, and how long before the pitchforks are at their door? But yeah, that kind of very stark automatic, and also the noticing that it can be statistically shown that I guess same-sex marriage erodes whatever assertion this was, this terminology, this language
Well,
of
it erodes society because it's not God's plan.
yeah, I understand that. But what he said was it can be statistically shown, which is a lot of malarkey, but it's also part of the rhetoric that
Mhm.
folks are being fed, are being, just a logic surrounded by a bunch of, they've got their references, um, they've got their literatures, they can point to academics, they've got their expert, yeah, they are strapped tight, but they are not in a modality of debate. They're not in a modality of critical thinking, in any way, in any way. But I found that kind of interesting, this notion that it can be statistically shown. So there's this kind of nod to scientific variability, even as there's a transition from any kind of reference point in evidence.
Well, I think we've made that point before, though, right? That they're not opposed to all science, right? It's however the science can be useful, and certainly the capitalists are not opposed to all science, just the science that allows them to continue to plunder. And
Yeah.
he knows his audience, right, or his interviewer. So let me use the rhetorical appeal to statistical knowledge.
Be statistically
And we
shown.
also know that statistics can be deployed in multiple ways, right? Or
But do we? Do we know that?
well, we know, yes, we do.
That
And so by virtue of we saying it, now our audience knows also, right? And I think most people are familiar with there's what is it? I forget the phrase, right? There's statistics, and then there are lies, and then there are statistics, something like that, right?
Right. And
Um,
statistic lies and damn lies or something like that.
something
Yeah.
like that.
Hmm.
But yeah, with that, and certainly, yeah, Betty can produce some statistics without context, right? And so again, you can make stats say what you want them to say often, if you frame it, you know, in a particular way.
And so long as
Um,
you're the only
and
storyteller.
and the statistics he might be pointing to is um, fewer and fewer people are getting married, and that doesn't mean there's some kind of correlation.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, it might be that simple. Well, you see that
Right.
there's a rise in single family homes, and
It could be
okay,
anything.
what
Right.
do you think, sir? The cost of living might have anything to do with that, right? Or
Which is
whether
same as it is around the
are
world.
you aware of the studies that have been done, right?
Yeah.
That talk about men in particular, um, you know, marriage hesitation based because of traditional notions of
Right.
can I provide, right?
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and this appeal to tradition,
Yeah.
because it's like the mythology of tradition.
Yep.
Um, we've always done it this way, and so we continue to do it this way. The family has always been such and such, without any you know
Wow.
any historical sense of how family has evolved, right? Notions of family, who and what constitutes family, has evolved, over time, and under what economic conditions, and
Yeah.
just this notion of it's got to be a wife,
Yeah.
a husband,
Yeah.
and however many children they have, and that wife should be staying home,
Unless
being a
polygamy is
traditional wife.
cool. Unless
Well,
polygamy
yeah,
is cool.
exactly. Unless
Okay.
polygamy is the tradition,
Yeah.
and that is not the tradition in this society, such that that from the very beginning,
Widespread appeal.
the
Mm-hmm.
Mormon, those Mormons who profess polygamy remained a minority,
Mm-hmm.
even among Latter Day Saints folks, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the reasons for the many splits in the original, Joseph Smith movement after his death,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not, um, right, and that's what's wrong with the Muslims, right, and some of these other folks, that they allow you to, that they don't respect the family with these multiple wives and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, all these, so this the mythology that the family is one thing, and it has always been that
Yeah.
forever and into perpetuity, and
Yeah.
that's the problem.
Yeah.
um
And
in
there's
a number of reasons. What if it's a father and a grandfather
and
raising a
there's all
child?
kinds of things to and there's all kinds of evidence, observable evidence to the contrary.
Statistical evidence.
Statistical evidence,
Right.
right? Because it's been observed enough, and that those observations recorded in such a way, right?
Decades of observation now, right? And
Yeah.
research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and so um
But
it's
never a critique of the economy, right? And the economic
never a
pressures on
critique of the
families
economy.
and
Never a
on
critique of the
individuals.
economy. Absolutely.
These economic relations.
No. Never a and the critique of a politic isn't really a critique of a politic. It's devolves into more of this question of culture wars,
Mhm.
and the mythologies of uh the occupied positions of power, the positions of power that have been overrun by essentially by
Mhm.
the forces of the enemy, of
Mhm.
the what is it? The opposer, the what is the, I don't know what, I don't remember what, I can't call the term. I think it's something that happens in Islam. The adversary.
The
Um,
adversary. Yeah.
yeah. Um, and so it It's all just this very self-contained. It's all very self-contained. So, you can't really get in there. You can't really get in there by by usual means, by conversational means,
Let's be clear, though, and several of the scholars and journalists who've been studying this phenomena for a while. You mentioned Chris Hedges is
Yes.
one.
Yes.
The roots of political evangelical Christianity in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and especially its emergence into, into electoral politics. Absolutely a reaction to the civil rights movement, the opening up of the society, the taking down of the of various kinds of racial barriers, the legal and the customary practices of Jim Crow, school integration chief among them. And the racist roots of the movement should never be washed over. And that indeed a lot of the reaction, these
Yes.
Black children
Yes.
sitting next to my little Billy and Sally,
Mhm.
And so the boom in these religious white only schools, particularly in the South,
Yes.
and then those schools being challenged, having their tax exempt status challenged because of their discriminatory practices. And these are things that are happening in the late 70s, early 80s. And this is one of the other highly motivating dynamics that that fuels the religious right. And
Mhm.
I cannot remember the name of the documentary.
Mhm.
It might be Kingdom Come, but I'm
Mhm.
not positive. A
Mhm.
documentary of the mid 1980s or late 1980s, looking at the evangelical movement.
Mhm.
And what's his name? Pat Robertson is caught on tape, saying as much, right?
Mhm.
The evil of the civil rights movement, and the need to save white America.
Mhm.
More or less using that language, even
Mhm.
as they very slickly, right, opened up space for Black membership.
Right.
But it's kind of like Black folks who know how to, stay in their lane and
Absolutely.
support the message.
Yes.
I'm like, whenever I see these, Black students at Liberty University, and I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, y'all don't know the history of Jerry Falwell, do you? Or is it taught as a redemption story, right? Because I've never heard of it being taught as that, he somehow changed his mind, because Jerry Falwell was absolutely opposed
Right.
to, desegregation,
Right. Mhm.
and as an animating force
Mhm.
for his move into politics, um, after being opposed to that, but also again, and covered in the film that you sent me.
Yeah.
What was it? American Heretics.
Yeah.
Uh, um,
And also referring to me, drop this in, a topic that was discussed in the Chris Hedges interview that I referred to earlier, where the historian that was in studio with him talked about being wrong about the presumption that white supremacy, right, and certainly in this current iteration is only a white face, that
mhm,
representation of people of color in these. He was speaking specifically from the point of view of his experiences in, work he did in Trump rallies,
mhm,
and the phenomenon of the uh of the, Black representation there, and also, um, the phenomenon of Black membership in these Christian nationalist white supremacist churches, and these kinds of things. You described one which we haven't talked about, the accelerationists in the Civil War, uh, the Second Civil War uh, promoters, or that group of folks. But this was his description of the church he was describing. It was like, yeah, and anybody who can align themselves with white supremacy actually has which is not, there's nothing about that should be surprising, you know, because it's a hierarchy, it's about a place, it's about, and certainly, I still would like to be a fly on the wall post, 1968, who is aligned, who still kind of aligns themselves with, has the capacity to kind of align themselves with it. That's an interesting question to me. But bottom line, yeah, there are absolutely people who have been absolutely harmed. African people, people of African descent, uh, and other people who find themselves quite comfortable and in solidarity with, and I don't know if solidarity is the right
Well, I
term.
would say that if you are an American patriot, you've aligned yourself with white supremacy. I mean, period, right? Whether you're in one of these churches or not. Yeah, that's been long an issue, right?
Okay.
Folks of color who more or less, either consciously or unconsciously,
Mm-hmm.
are advancing, white supremacist ideas and relations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
I mean,
people do,
yeah,
which folks do that in all kinds of ways, because I think that
in
there's
all kinds of ways.
I'm thinking of a couple of people
Hmm.
that that are personal
In all kinds of ways. And
connections
the appeal to tradition,
for themselves. Yeah, consider
the appeal
themselves
to
patriot,
tradition,
and also
and yeah, go ahead.
consider themselves patriots, and also consider this whole concept of that's not who we are, the concept of what this country has given me, what this country has given us, what this country has, how we've been able to do this, that, and the other in this great country, and it's changed, and consider themselves patriotic to a set of values that they think have had this inevitable outcome
Exactly.
of social mobility for African people.
Right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, that's just another way of supporting white supremacy, though, right? I mean,
Yeah, it is. They don't
it's a
think so.
different kind of Kool-Aid that you have drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
how most people, right? It's just a different kind of Kool-Aid, and a commitment to the mythology of the country. To it's all aspirational, and because it's all aspirational, we can ignore the actual crimes, and even current conditions, and the doubling down on the conditions, because we live in the aspiration, and that is a drug that folks need to kick.
Opiate
Right?
of the people.
All kinds of folks. I mean, I am astounded, and we'll never understand it. The pride that some Mexicans, some Native Americans have in their service to the United States, their military service to the United States. But I'm not, I don't. But then the black folks too, though. So I think y'all all crazy. I mean, I
Don't get
understand how powerful it is, and who wants to be kind of on the outside. But I think that is sickness. That and to be, a proud, black Frenchman, etc. Right? All, all their various forms of what is the condition, Stockholm syndrome, and an over-identification with the oppressor, and really as a survival technique, right? And sort of to preserve one's mental health by, choosing which insanity, right? You're,
Yeah.
you're going to,
Yeah. And,
live
and it's
with. So.
and it's the Chris Rock joke, and it comes back to also relies a lot on that same lack of information and alternative narratives, right? There's a logic to it, right? As Chris Rock
Yes. And it's
infamously
a
said.
religiosity, as again, we're talking about religion. And it's, it is a commitment to the belief.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters, is
And
that
as
commitment to the belief.
And as Chris Rock said, I'm glad my ancestors were slow and whatever else he said, slow and whatever
Whatever else he said.
whatever it was, the blessing, of the enslavement ordeal to
And to
take
me, that's a mental health. That's a statement. That is an admission of, a mental health problem, right? I'm glad my ancestors got captured, type thing. And again, it's ahistorical, just in not making the connection between Africa's underdevelopment and its depopulation over centuries.
Absolutely, but it's also based in at not having access or experience with the narrative that explicitly lays out that
I don't know we can say that about Chris Rock.
Oh, well, I don't know about Chris Rock.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know. He said it, right? I don't know that we can say that about Chris Rock.
When I say Chris Rock, I'm talking about something that's emblematic of the thought, of the notion. If you're using Chris Rock emblematically, okay, but I'm not talking about Chris Rock and what he knows. But tell me if you're using Chris Rock emblematic.
I'm using Chris Rock the way you used it. You said, here's Chris Rock's joke. So I'm talking about Chris Rock.
Okay, well, I was using Chris Rock emblematically, right? As Chris Rock says, as we've heard Black people say in a million different ways, what a blessing, that we are not in Africa, that terrible, backward, impoverished, demonic, all of these things, and that certainly at no time has that been all of us, at no time has that been all of us. And okay.
I don't know that that's been most of us. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. In my lifetime, I've only heard one person say it, actually. And that was in 8th grade. A young man in 8th grade said it.
Okay.
That's my lifetime, though, and that's anecdotal, but very familiar with the sentiment. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I hear it all the time in high schools in our communities, almost daily,
I do not have that experience.
Okay.
I know the sentiment exists. I've heard it once directly myself. I haven't heard it ever from students. I can't recall. It was too long ago when I taught high school that I think if that would have come up, right? I wouldn't be surprised. But anyway, yeah, I still think it's a minority position, right? And as many of these are, but they're also amplified, right? Minority position, like the Republican Party, a minority party, but it's amplified and has the organs, right, to amplify it. I mean, I don't know if people were saying that when everybody was very excited about Reverend Price, right, and Reverend Price's lectures on blacks in the Bible, and there was that people still wear their kente, right, in these formal settings and stuff in these churches, right, in these Black churches anyway. And actually, I found that somewhat unsettling. The growing number of Black faces in these white churches, particularly the mega churches, and even the notion that they aren't white churches, they're just churches. But no, they're white churches with Black people and maybe some Latin people and etc. But they're white churches. And it's very different because I'm going to my mother's Baptist church growing up. We would go often on first Sundays, and there were almost always a few white people, right, who came to church there. But they came to a black church, right, and they knew they were coming to a black church, not just a church.
Mhm.
Anyway, I think the appeal and why the appeal is made and why it's attractive even to people who are self-described conscious, anti-Western, even whatever, but the appeal to tradition and traditional notions of family and
Mhm.
traditional
Mhm.
gender roles. It's
Mhm.
appealing, right? It's
Mhm.
and it's appealing because everyone's having a hard time, I believe, in dealing with the kind of social kind of dismantling of these structures,
Mhm.
the way that economic changes have challenged, made nearly impossible,
Yes.
the ability to live this idealized life that folks are talking about, where dad can go to work and make enough money to take care of the family, and
Yeah.
mother can stay home. That this just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The demands of neoliberalism, and then the emergent movements emerging in the mid 20th century, to challenge the family, right? To challenge the hierarchical structure of the family,
Mhm.
and that has been unsettling.
Mhm.
Um, to
As the discussion of gender
Exactly, I was just about to
constructs.
say,
Yeah.
the challenge to to these notions of gender roles and gender equality, and very public efforts to create programs for girls, um, and there has been an element in which boys have been ignored and left prey to these forces, right?
Mhm.
Because nobody is dealing with, well, what does this mean for you now? The
Mhm.
world is changing, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and what is masculinity? What is manliness? Right? Is
Yeah.
been under threat, or not threat. Well, yeah, threat to certain ideas of masculinity, but
Yeah.
going back to at least since my boyhood, right? And uh, battle of the sexes, and um, you know, if you're committed to democracy and to everybody's created equal, why aren't girls? Why aren't women? Right? And there's no logic that will hold up. Right? That says, well, because for this reason. No, if we're all just, but that unsettling.
Mhm.
Folks who from the very beginning have been pushing back. This is the devil. Women belong, and all this. Um, and then the real efforts to, we got to um, the focus on girls, um, but it's in such a way that boys have been ignored, or demonized in some kind of way, and the right, the religious right, and the political right have been able to exploit that, right? Exploit those insecurities,
Mhm.
instead of um, taking seriously, yeah, can we talk about different ways of being masculine? And even these notions of, these Western notions of masculinity aren't universal. They aren't um, for always and forever. And I just recall my
Mhm.
a, a friend and partner from when I was an undergraduate,
Mhm.
in San Francisco, and she was from Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And she would always make a distinction. She, said, "Oh, the men in Peru are so much." No, well, what I like about about Peruvian men is that you don't get all that macho that you get. That it's just different, right? There's a different culture there. There's a different culture of men right there, and
Mm-hmm.
much more open and emotive and all the various things. But her main point was not the kind of macho, you do what I say because I said it because I'm a man type
Mm-hmm.
thing, and that was a distinct difference for her, being a Peruvian who grew up in San Diego among Mexicans. So really sort of grew up. She and her siblings, they really grew up like Chicana, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though they were Peruvian, but they
Mm-hmm.
grew up Chicana.
Right.
But you have that to compare, right? Also,
Mm-hmm.
the differences and the way her father, which is just not to say that there aren't the vestiges of patriarchy and all that.
No, yeah, but
But
what you're asserting is what her experience and what her statement
there
was.
are
Yeah.
differences in how people over the
Yeah.
years and places have defined what it means to be a man, and it has not always meant that you got to be a bully, right? Or you got to be
Yeah.
tough and all this. And again, a couple of years ago, the very fine work one of my students did for her research project, looking at pre-colonial gender relations in Africa, and basically came to the conclusion based on the research. And she did excellent research, a very thorough research, that what the gender relations as they exist now, and insofar as they are, um, you know, uh, uh, male centered and hierarchical in that way, are primarily a result of colonialism, and the colonial legacy, and modern African men learning to act like modern European men, and instead of maintaining the more equitable gender relations of pre-colonial Africa, pre-Islamic Africa, pre-Christian Africa. Although that's hard to say too, because anybody who knows the actual history of Christianity knows that women were quite prominent in Christianity as leaders, at least for the first couple of centuries, right? Again, right until maybe Constantine again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if you really know your Christian history,
Well, that's the whole thing about history and this whole thing about science and empiricism and the tools of empiricism that take us beyond the reach of sight,
yeah,
beyond the last thing I remember was, the last thing you remember is maybe what your grandparents did, and if that's all that is truth, then
yeah,
we're really in trouble. So that again, that um a lack of exposure to these diverging stories and examples that cause us to question. And yes, as you're saying, yeah, it can be deeply disturbing to find yourself in questioning of things that you have staked your identity on, even if it hasn't been a powerful stake. It doesn't mean that it was such a such a you didn't necessarily have to be coming in with some kind of, since we're talking about masculinity, because I'm kind of super macho, kind of, embedded, ingrained kind of thing going on, but just these taken for granted notions, common
mhm,
sense notions, that we talk about, that folk feel that they're referring to. And yeah, a sense of, it provides this thing with the traditionalism. It provides a sense of comfort, a
comfort
sense
and predictability.
of predictability, surety,
A surety,
a
exactly.
sense of certainty, a sense of,
Certainty. People know
yeah,
their place.
that this is something that is, yeah,
And if you're
reliable.
unhappy in your place, you just need to pray on it some more.
Exactly. So that's the whole, that's also another piece, the way in which people, humans will endure all kinds of discomfort and
Yeah,
all kinds of suffering if they think it's for the quote unquote right reason, if they
that's
think it's
right.
for the right thing. Um, and
You
so
know,
here,
I think Arundhati Roy has, I think, a really just very simple and profound in its simplicity insight on that. Right? Is in the novel The God of Small Things, and
Mhm.
the little girl, I think Rahel, asks, why is she crying for him? Why is she crying for him? He used to beat her every night. And the response is because people will get used to anything. Just simple, because people will get used to
To
anything.
anything, to anything. And so, yeah, I mean, being a warrior for the preservation of fundamental human ethics, fundamental, and they are there, and they are
Mhm.
somewhat, they are somewhat whatever, not trying to be impeccable if I use the term universal. I'm not trying to be
Mhm.
impeccably place that term. And I'm thinking about Baba, talking about universal ethics, universally accepted mores and whatnot. And this kind of, one of those mores is uh, the notion that the human shouldn't be abused. Humans shouldn't abuse each other. There should not be an
And
abusive
that is a progressive notion.
war. And that is it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. So that might be a good time to end at
Well, yes, but it is. But I want to just kind of recap. When we say religion and the right wing and the war on progress, we are specific. To be specific, talking about various types of social progress, the progress that would actually, make an equitable life, equitable access to power and leadership, and leadership in all areas for women, for those who are non-gender conforming in one way or another, sexual minorities,
Mm-hmm.
for those who are believers but believe heretically, for those who are non-believers,
Hmm.
um, for an appreciation of secularism that does not suppress religion, but that also does not allow religion to be suppressive. Um, for the equitable,
Hmm.
the equitable distribution of wealth, as too often religion and certainly the religious right um, has
Mm-hmm.
found, has been opposed to socialism, communism, and even those those reformist solutions that would at least mitigate some of the suffering, even if that seems too socialistic, right? um, and to even to the point of being opposed to the democratization of power, right? And democracy as a model of power, or a model of governance, and a model for the state. And if democracy is just another form of the state, I think it's a preferable form to more hierarchical forms. The so and um, uh, to the discoveries of science, of the physical sciences, the life sciences, and even the application of the scientific method
Right.
to the social
Helpful
sciences,
questions. Yes.
and opposed to the arts and the arts' ability to address any and all of these questions in unconventional and challenging and even mocking ways, as we would hope in a free society. Um, that's the progress, right? That's the war on progress. That's the effort to actually turn back the clock, to turn back the decades,
Yes.
take us to some mythical time that never existed, when, you know, some of them are saying it plainly, when, the right people knew their place and stayed in it, even though that too is a myth, because when did it when
When
did
was that? When
ever
was that?
stay in their place? If that were the case, you wouldn't have need the police forces you created, and you wouldn't have
Right.
needed chastity belts and all these other things. You
Any
wouldn't
of
have
these
needed the
things.
various apparati of control
Right.
if people knew to stay in their
Their
place or
place.
didn't want to push back. So
Yep.
I just wanted to reiterate that,
Yes.
right? What we mean by, what is this war on progress? And it
Yes.
is really a war on that democratization,
Yes.
equality for all, a dignified life for all, because the resources
Yes.
exist,
Yes.
a better relationship with our natural environment and each other, peace
Yes.
possible in this world,
Yes.
um, all these things, right?
Yes.
What's so funny?
About peace, love, and understanding. I was
That's
just
simple.
say yes. The part of the challenge, or I think, well, yeah, a major part of the challenge, but I don't think that it's
Thank you,
necessary.
Elvis Costello, by the way. But yeah, go.
Yes, thank you, Elvis Costello. Um, but yeah, a major part of the challenge, not that it's a major challenge, is the thing that I think need be amplified is that this that is being described, that you just described, is not merely aspirational as it is often
Right.
accused. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? It is accessible. It is right. It is demonstrable.
It is
We understand
demonstrable.
it's demonstrable. Just, again, something that's observable, just as tense and divided as folks are becoming uh with these things baited and these issues teased out and those energies drummed up in an atmosphere of immiseration and tension and economic loss and inability to see a way forward and all of those kinds of things. um Back in the days where there was a middle class of whatever that means, where enough of the folks in the American population could see some kind of could make a living, right?
Mhm.
And could meet their, could make a living and have some and participate in culture and enjoy some shit and, do these kinds of things. People were still, were not neutralized, had not been immunized against racism and patriarchy, and you know what I'm saying? But somehow it was not, it wasn't people weren't trying to tear each other apart other over the issues. And I should restate. I should better say, white settlers weren't so angsted up. Not as a collective piece and anti. Same level of what the impolite racism, the same level of, accepting conventional ethics that haven't really been deeply searched out or whatnot, but in outside of a context of economic striving and suffering and loss and what have you, and the manipulation, people are still not, "Rah," you know what I mean? It's the invoking of that energy that is what this thing is about. And I just said all that to say that even in, you know, circumstances where folks aren't trying, the tendency is for people to be kind of cool. You know, coolness doesn't depend on enlightenment all the time. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of cool. If I got enough and you got, if I got enough, then I'm not necessarily, I'm less likely to, well, I don't know if that's exactly it. Because if that was it, then the wealthy would be fine. And
Well, yeah,
be
well, it
manipulating
is true
me.
though that the economic strain ratchets up the insecurity, and then those things begin to emerge, and the wealthy, in some ways, count on that, right? Because if we aren't being cool with each other, then we can't get together and turn our sights on them. So they are quite skilled at keeping us unsettled,
Mm-hmm.
not not enough, so people are anxious, and then get into that well, I need to protect what I have mode. I mean, as you've pointed out before, when they do these surveys, and where are folks happiest in the world, they seem to be these Scandinavian countries, and one of the reasons they're happy in those Scandinavian countries is they don't have to stress about things like, am I going to be able to afford home health care for my aging parent? Because the state is going to take care of that, right? And the state is going to take care of I've got universal child care, so I don't have to worry about that, and etc. That the way in which the establishment of that and protection of that social um, the social welfare system, so that people don't have to worry about those fundamental things that keep us on edge and keep us worried and stressed, and then that reflex action of well, I got to protect mine, if somebody's coming to get it, keeping us at each other's throats basically, or in crisis mode, right? Always in fight or flight mode.
Mm-hmm.
So that we don't have the chance to live completely fulfilling lives and just be cool with each other, and even have whatever crazy beliefs we want to have, because I ain't got to worry about. I'm good though.
Not really worried about
But even
anything.
that has been, just the notion is demonized, right? That the Lord said, "You will always have the poor. Therefore, you should not try to get rid of the poor." Even though, well, the first thing the Christians did was, hold everything in common and make sure they took care of the widows and the orphans.
Hmm.
That was number one, right? Those early according to the scripture, that's what the Christians did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pool their resources, live in common,
Hmm.
and make sure that the widows and the orphans were taken care of. First
Damn.
duty, right?
Welfare queens. What are you talking about?
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm telling you. They're saying
Wow.
they're saying Jesus was too woke,
Too
and them
woke.
early Christians were too woke,
Crazy.
holding everything in common.
Crazy.
That's the same root word as communism.
Right.
Come on
Crazy.
now.
It's crazy.
The
About to
anyway,
take Jesus out of it. Hmm?
we're beyond 2 hours now,
We
so we can go ahead and say good night.
Good night, Yusuf.
And you got nothing else to add?
No, I have nothing else to add. This
Okay.
was very satisfying.
Then I will. Yes, it was. I think so. As we're and we were able to share some things with folks, and so yeah, if you watch this later, besides the work of Catherine Stewart, you can look up Chris Hedges, who again has been writing on this. And I think that Chris Hedges has a recent interview with Catherine Stewart, in fact, on this. And so many other folks are writing about this, and I enjoyed the film that you sent me, that I watched earlier today. Try to find its title real quick. American Heretics,
Mm-hmm.
which was, really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, American Heretics, The Untold Truth About Faith in the Most Conservative State in America, something like that, or the U.S. Anyway, it was very good, right? As it amplified what we were talking about. Not all Christians are conservative. That notion has to be challenged. In fact, most Christians in this country are probably liberal or centrist, whatever that means, or progressive or centrist, right? Whatever that, however people are defining that. But that this group of highly energized and now well-funded and connected evangelical fundamentalist Christians, conservative Catholics, conservative Orthodox, conservative Jews, conservative Orthodox, period.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually the minority. They're actually the minority in all of the various, religious communities. They are just right now the most well-funded and well-platformed right now, and in some ways are served by the technology in terms of algorithms and algorithmic.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
How that ends up working.
Yeah.
So yeah, we covered a lot.
Yes.
And
just opened it
giving
up.
folks some stuff to, yeah, exactly, and folks they can go look up, because there's a lot of work out there on it, right? And and I know we were referring to some of that, our own reading and viewing on the topic, and because now we're at a point where it's having direct effect on people's day-to-day lives, whether they are believers or not, or members of these particular communities or not. We're all being directly affected by it.
Yes.
And we didn't talk about this, and I know we're past 2 hours now.
Yeah.
But this worldview, as I see, Chris Hedges on Christian nationalism, the Christian nationalism, and that Christian nationalism, in many cases, is cross-denominational, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
thoroughly informs the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025.
Mm-hmm.
This project for leadership, which again is now being implemented.
Mm-hmm.
And this coming together of the religious right and all of its various manifestations, and the political right, and the billionaires that fund both organizations to create this world that they want.
That they want, yes.
That they want, and
Which
that
we
the rest of us suffer.
tease out as we go forward in this little series on religion, and the right wing. Tease out those areas of emphasis, right? What it is to look at and clue into.
Yes. So we'll say good night. 9 o'clock on the West Coast, midnight on the East Coast. If you're watching, or when you watch, please do subscribe. Please like, and do please share. And with that, I will close with the words of Bob Marley. It takes a revolution to make a solution. We'll see y'all next week.